The morning sun had barely brushed the mountaintops when Private James Miller began his routine patrol through the dense forests of northern Montana. His boots pressed softly against the autumn leaves, the only sound breaking through the unusual silence of the wilderness. Something about this morning felt different. Even after just 3 months of border patrol duty in this remote outpost, he had learned to trust his instincts. The weight of his standard-issue rifle was a reassuring presence against his shoulder as he moved along the familiar trail. His commanding officer had warned him about increased wildlife activity this season, but so far he had only encountered a few deer and the occasional fox during his previous patrols. His training had covered the basics of wildlife protocols. Keep your distance, avoid interaction, report anything unusual. Simple rules that had served him well until now. The forest stretched endlessly before him, a maze of towering pines and dense undergrowth. The early morning fog clung low to the ground, wrapping around the tree trunks like ghostly fingers. James checked his watch. 0600 hours. His patrol had just begun, yet the unnatural stillness made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. No bird song, no rustling in the undergrowth, just an eerie, suffocating calm. Back at base, they had laughed at his city background, a Brooklyn boy assigned to wilderness patrol. The irony wasn't lost on him. Everything he knew about wild animals came from training manuals and brief orientation sessions. Bears avoid humans. Wolves keep their distance. Mountain lions rarely show themselves. Nature follows predictable patterns, or at least that's what they had taught him. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of pine and damp earth as James continued along his patrol route. His boots left clear imprints in the morning dew, marking his passage through the untamed wilderness. Somewhere ahead lay the boundary between the United States and Canada, an invisible line that meant nothing to the wildlife, but everything to his mission. The rising sun gradually burned away the mist, revealing more of the forest around him. James paused to make his first routine report over the radio. Everything normal, everything peaceful, everything as it should be. Yet that gnawing feeling in his gut refused to fade. His grandfather had always told him that soldiers survive by trusting their instincts. And right now, his instincts were screaming that this seemingly ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. He took a sip from his water canteen, scanning the tree line with sharp, practiced eyes. The forest seemed to watch him in return, holding secrets he couldn't yet comprehend. 3 hours into his 12-hour patrol, and already the day felt off. The silence was too complete, the calm too perfect. In his short time here, James had learned one crucial truth about nature. When the forest goes quiet, something is about to happen. Little did he know, this ordinary patrol would test everything he thought he knew about wildlife, about nature, and about his own courage. The peaceful morning was merely nature's quiet breath before plunging him into an encounter that would change his life forever. A movement in the underbrush caught James's attention. His trained eyes focused on a cluster of ferns about 50 yards ahead. The rustling was too deliberate for a deer, too careful for a moose. His grip tightened on his rifle as he followed protocol, creating distance between himself and the unknown threat. The movement stopped. Then, against every natural law he had learned, 2 small brown bear cubs emerged from the foliage. Something was wrong. Every survival guide, every training manual, every piece of wilderness wisdom screamed that bear cubs meant a protective mother nearby. But these cubs moved with strange purpose. Instead of running away at the sight of a human, they stepped closer, their dark eyes fixed on James with an intelligence that sent chills down his spine. Their fur was matted with morning dew, suggesting they had been traveling for hours. The smaller of the 2 cubs took another step forward. Its movements were not the playful waddle typical of young bears. There was urgency in every step. The cub's eyes never left James's face as it moved closer, stopping every few feet as if making sure he was watching. The second cub followed, slightly larger but showing the same unusual behavior. Neither made a sound, which struck James as profoundly unnatural. His radio felt heavy on his belt. Protocol demanded he report any bear sighting immediately, but something held him back. The cubs were now 30 yards away, their behavior so far removed from anything his training had covered. They showed no fear, no aggression. Instead, they exhibited something he had never expected to see in wild animals: purpose. The smaller cub suddenly sat back on its haunches and lifted its front paws, a gesture so human-like that James nearly dropped his rifle. It repeated the motion, looking directly at him, then turning its head back toward the direction they had come from. The larger cub paced back and forth, its movements becoming more agitated, more insistent. They were trying to communicate. James's mind raced through his options. Standard procedure said to back away slowly, to never engage with wildlife, especially bear cubs. But these cubs were breaking every rule of wild animal behavior. They approached again, this time with soft whimpers that sounded almost like pleading. The smaller one made that same lifting gesture, its eyes holding an expression that seemed impossible for a wild animal. Fear, desperation, intelligence. The morning silence suddenly felt heavy with meaning. No bird song because the forest was holding its breath. No wildlife sounds because something had disrupted the natural order. And now these cubs acting with such clear purpose, trying so hard to communicate with a human. Everything James knew about wildlife behavior told him to retreat. Everything his instincts told him about intelligence and desperation urged him to understand. Both cubs moved in perfect synchronization, taking steps forward, then looking back the way they came, then returning their gaze to James. Their movements formed a clear pattern. "Follow us." The message was as plain as if they had spoken it. The larger cub stood on its hind legs, swaying slightly, its eyes never leaving James's face. The smaller one continued its peculiar gesturing, each movement more desperate than the last. The sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows through the trees. James checked his surroundings again, looking for signs of the mother bear. The cub's behavior suggested she wasn't nearby, which opened up even more unsettling questions. Young cubs never strayed far from their mother, never approached humans, never acted with such clear, intelligent purpose. Yet here they were, deliberately seeking human help, showing behaviors that shouldn't be possible. The smaller cub made a sound unlike anything James had heard before. Not a growl or a typical bear vocalization, but something that could only be described as a plea. It echoed through the quiet forest, carrying such raw emotion that James felt it in his chest. The larger cub joined in, their combined sounds creating a harmony of desperation that broke through every barrier of species and training. As James watched, frozen between protocol and compassion, the cubs began a dance of communication that would haunt him forever. They moved with the precision of creatures driven by something far beyond simple animal instinct. Their eyes held a depth of understanding that challenged everything he thought he knew about wildlife. And with each passing moment, their desperation became more palpable, more urgent, drawing him into a mystery that would soon reveal its shocking truth. Time seemed to stand still in the forest as James watched the cub's extraordinary behavior unfold. The smaller cub had begun a series of movements that defied everything known about wild animals. It would take several steps forward, then look back at James with an intensity that felt almost human. When he didn't move, the cub would return, its small paws leaving deliberate prints in the morning dew, and repeat the sequence with increasing urgency. The larger cub added to this strange display by circling around its sibling, then moving closer to James than any wild animal should dare. Its chocolate brown eyes held a clarity of purpose that sent shivers through him. The cub would rise on its hind legs, front paws gesturing in the air, then drop back down and take several steps in the direction they had come from. The pattern was unmistakable, the message crystal clear. "Follow us." James found himself lowering his rifle, his training warring with the undeniable intelligence he was witnessing. The cubs moved with a synchronization that spoke of desperate purpose. When one would advance, the other would watch James. When one retreated a few steps, the other would move forward. They were working together, coordinating their efforts to communicate with a human. The behavior was so far beyond normal animal instincts that James felt his understanding of wildlife crumbling with each passing moment. The morning air had grown warmer, but James barely noticed. His attention was completely captured by the cubs' persistent attempts to convey their message. They had been at this dance of communication for nearly 20 minutes, showing no signs of giving up. Their dedication suggested something of tremendous importance driving their actions. Wild animals, especially young bears, never maintained such prolonged contact with humans. Yet these cubs seem willing to break every rule of nature to get their message across. A ray of sunlight broke through the canopy, illuminating the cubs as they continued their extraordinary performance. The light revealed details James hadn't noticed before. Their fur was ruffled in places, suggesting a difficult journey. Their movements, while purposeful, carried a hint of exhaustion. These cubs had been traveling for some time, driven by something urgent enough to override their natural fear of humans. The smaller cub suddenly changed its tactics. It approached closer than ever before, its small body trembling with either fear or exhaustion. Just 15 feet from James, it sat back and lifted both front paws in a gesture that seemed almost like a prayer. The larger cub positioned itself slightly behind, watching the forest behind them with nervous glances. They were exposing themselves, making themselves vulnerable. Everything wild animals should never do. James's hand moved to his radio 3 times, and 3 times he pulled it back. How could he possibly report this? Who would believe that 2 bear cubs were deliberately attempting to communicate with a human? The smaller cub's eyes followed his movement each time, showing an understanding of human gestures that should have been impossible. It seemed to know that James was struggling with a decision, and its next actions proved it. The cub rose again, this time turning completely around and taking several determined steps in the direction they had come from. It stopped, looked back at James with an expression that could only be described as pleading, then repeated the movement. The message was becoming more insistent. Time was clearly a factor in whatever drove these cubs to seek human help. Years of training and protocols fought against the growing certainty in James's mind. Every manual, every guideline, every rule of wilderness interaction said to avoid following wildlife, especially bears. But these cubs had shattered every preconception about wild animal behavior. Their actions showed not just intelligence but reasoning, not just instinct but purpose. They weren't just moving randomly. They were trying to lead him somewhere. The larger cub had begun making soft whimpering sounds, unlike anything James had heard in his training videos about bear behavior. The sound carried notes of urgency and distress that transcended species barriers. Its sibling joined in, their combined vocals creating a symphony of desperation that seemed to echo through the still forest. They were begging now, using every means at their disposal to convince him. James felt the moment his resistance crumbled. These cubs had demonstrated more intelligence and determination than he had ever thought possible in wild animals. They had maintained their focused attempt at communication far longer than any natural behavior would explain. Whatever drove them to seek human help had to be significant. The growing certainty that he needed to understand, needed to help, finally outweighed his training. Taking a deep breath, James took one step in their direction. The reaction was immediate and astonishing. Both cubs perked up, their entire demeanor changing from desperation to what could only be described as hope. They moved forward with renewed energy, constantly looking back to ensure he was following. Their coordinated movements now had a clear purpose. They were guides, and they had finally convinced their chosen human to follow. The forest had grown denser as James followed his unusual guides deeper into unknown territory. The cubs moved with surprising speed, yet maintained a perfect distance. Not too far that he would lose sight of them, not too close to make him uncomfortable. Their intelligence showed even in this careful balance, proving with each step that their behavior was far beyond simple animal instinct. Sunlight filtered through the thick canopy, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. James checked his watch. He had been following the cubs for nearly 40 minutes, moving steadily uphill through increasingly rough terrain. Every few yards, the cubs would pause in perfect synchronization. The smaller one would look back, making that same pleading gesture, while its siblings scanned the path ahead. Only when they were certain James was still following would they continue their urgent journey. The familiar trails had long disappeared. They were moving through untouched wilderness now, following a path that only the cubs seemed to know. Fallen logs and thick undergrowth made progress difficult, yet the cubs navigated each obstacle with practiced ease. They would wait patiently when James had to climb over massive tree trunks or push through dense brush, their eyes never leaving him, their anxiety growing more visible with each delay. The morning had grown warm and sweat trickled down James's back. His training screamed at him with each step. Never follow wildlife. Never leave your patrol route. Never trust wild animals. Yet these cubs had shown such extraordinary behavior that normal rules seemed meaningless. They moved with purpose, communicated with intelligence, and displayed a level of trust in humans that defied everything he knew about wild animals. A sudden change in the cubs' behavior sent James's heart racing. They had stopped at the crest of a small rise, their bodies tense and alert. The larger cub turned completely around, facing James with an intensity that rooted him to the spot. Its sibling made that distinctive whimpering sound again, but this time the noise carried notes of both warning and encouragement. Something significant lay ahead. The forest had grown eerily quiet again. No birds called, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The cubs' anxiety was palpable now. They paced back and forth at the top of the rise, their movements becoming more urgent, more insistent. The smaller one stood on its hind legs, gesturing with increasing desperation. Whatever drove them to seek human help was close. James tightened his grip on his rifle, not for protection from the cubs, but from the growing sense that something was very wrong in these woods. The cubs had led him far from his patrol route, deep into territory he had never explored. Their behavior suggested they were approaching their destination, and their increasing agitation hinted at the urgency of the situation. The larger cub suddenly froze. Its ears perked forward. Its sibling immediately mirrored the pose. Both cubs now focused intently on something beyond the rise. Their synchronized reaction sent a chill down James's spine. Years of military training had taught him to read signs of danger, and everything about the cubs' behavior screamed that something significant waited just ahead. With deliberate slowness, the cubs began moving again, but their manner had changed. They crouched lower to the ground, their movements becoming more cautious. Yet they still maintained that incredible awareness of James, ensuring he followed their lead. Their eyes held a mix of fear and determination that transcended any normal animal behavior. They had brought him this far, breaking every rule of nature, and now they seemed almost afraid to show him their final destination. As they crested the rise, the true horror of the situation unfolded before James's eyes. In a small clearing below lay the massive form of a mother bear, but the scene was far worse than a simple injury. Around her lay the grim evidence of an extensive poaching operation. Metal snares glinted in the morning sun. Crude cages lined the edges of the clearing. The ground bore the scars of frequent vehicle tracks, suggesting regular activity in this hidden location. The mother bear lay breathing heavily, her large body caught in multiple snares that had been cruelly engineered to trap without killing. Blood matted her dark fur where the metal wires had cut deep. But what struck James most was the deliberate nature of the setup. This was no random trap. The entire clearing had been designed as a holding area. Scattered around were tranquilizer darts, shipping labels, and equipment used for processing captured wildlife. The cubs approached their mother with heart-wrenching whimpers, touching her gently with their paws. Her only response was a weak growl of recognition. James's military training kicked in as he surveyed the scene. The operation was professional and well-established. Tire tracks led away through a concealed path. Empty cages showed signs of recently holding various animals. This was an active wildlife trafficking center, hidden deep in the forest where no regular patrols would find it. Evidence of other victims lay scattered around the clearing. Tufts of wolf fur caught in cage bars, claw marks on metal surfaces, even what appeared to be mountain lion tracks in the mud. The poachers had created a sophisticated trapping ground for multiple species. The mother bear's capture seemed to be their latest operation, but the cubs had somehow escaped the trap that had snared their mother. The smaller cub returned to James, performing its pleading gesture with renewed desperation. Now the meaning was clear. They had witnessed their mother's capture, understood the human origin of her suffering, and made an incredible leap of intelligence. Somewhere in their past, they must have encountered kind humans, perhaps forest rangers or wildlife officers. That experience had given them the extraordinary insight to seek human help when faced with this crisis. Near the edge of the clearing, James discovered a makeshift shelter containing documentation, shipping manifests, international contacts, price lists for exotic animals. The operation was larger than he could have imagined. The poachers had created a sophisticated network for capturing and trafficking wildlife across borders. The mother bear was just their latest victim in what appeared to be a long-running criminal enterprise. Looking closer at the snares holding the mother bear, James noticed they were designed for live capture. The poachers wanted their targets alive for the wildlife black market. The cruel efficiency of their operation became clear. They would return soon, probably with tranquilizers and transport equipment. The cubs had led him here just in time, showing an understanding of urgency that seemed impossible for wild animals. The mother bear's eyes found James, showing no fear despite her condition. Like her cubs, she displayed an unusual calmness around humans. Instead of aggression, her gaze held something that looked remarkably like trust. The cubs moved between their mother and James, their behavior now focused on showing him the snares that held her. Their intelligence in this moment was staggering. They not only understood the source of the problem, but were actively showing him what needed to be fixed. James's hand moved to his radio, but he froze at a sudden sound from the concealed access road. The cubs immediately tensed, their behavior indicating they recognized the threat. The poachers were returning. Time was running out. The small family had placed their trust in him, defying every natural instinct to seek human help. Now that trust would be tested as James faced a decision that would change multiple lives forever. James moved quickly behind a fallen tree as the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. From his hidden position, he could see more clearly into the makeshift shelter. Maps covered one wall, marked with dozens of red dots that represented trapping locations. This wasn't just one site. It was an entire network stretching across both sides of the border. The operation was massive, professional, and had clearly been running for years. Among the scattered papers, he found a series of incident reports. The poachers had documented their problems with local forest guards and patrol units. One report caught his attention. 6 months ago, forest guards had discovered one of their sites and rescued several trapped animals. The mother bear and her cubs had been among those freed. The report noted with frustration that the bears had shown unusual comfort around the rescue team, making them easy to release. Everything suddenly made sense. The cubs remembered that rescue. They had experienced human kindness during that operation, watching as people freed them and their mother from similar traps. That experience had given them the extraordinary insight to seek human help again. Their intelligence went beyond mere instinct. They had observed, remembered, and reasoned their way through this crisis, showing cognitive abilities far beyond what anyone believed possible in wild animals. The poachers' documents revealed more disturbing details. They had been tracking this bear family since the previous rescue, noting their unusual behavior patterns. The mother had been teaching her cubs to avoid the traps, showing them how to recognize human tools and equipment. The poachers had called her abnormally intelligent, a problem animal that needed to be removed. They had specifically targeted her because she was teaching other bears to avoid their traps. More vehicles arrived in the clearing. Through the underbrush, James could see 6 heavily armed men emerging from 2 trucks. They moved with professional precision, checking the area before approaching the trapped bear. The cubs pressed closer to their mother, but remarkably, they didn't flee. They stayed visible, watching James with desperate hope, trusting him to act on the information they had worked so hard to deliver. The mother bear's history explained her calm acceptance of James's presence. Despite her current suffering, she showed no aggression as the cubs moved between her and their chosen human ally. The poacher's notes had documented her extraordinary behavior during the previous rescue, how she had remained calm and seemed to understand that the forest guards were helping. She had learned to distinguish between harmful and helpful humans, and had somehow passed this understanding to her cubs. Near the shelter, James found more evidence of the operation's scale. Financial records showed transactions worth millions of dollars. The poachers were supplying exotic animals to private collectors worldwide. Bears, wolves, mountain lions, all captured alive and shipped to the highest bidders. The red dots on their map represented only the current sites. Old maps showed dozens more locations, suggesting hundreds of animals had already passed through their operation. The intelligence of the bear family had presented a unique threat to their operation. The poachers' reports described how other bears had become harder to trap, learning from this mother's example. She had developed ways to detect their snares, taught her cubs to recognize the signs of human tools, and somehow communicated this knowledge to other bears in the area. The poachers had finally targeted her not just for profit, but to stop her from teaching others. Looking back at the cubs, James understood that he was witnessing something that would change our understanding of animal intelligence forever. These bears had not just learned to recognize human threats and help, they had developed the ability to categorize humans as either dangerous or helpful. When faced with crisis, they had remembered past experiences, made logical connections, and developed a plan that required sophisticated reasoning. They had sought out a human in uniform, recognizing the similarity to their previous rescuers. Within hours, the clearing had transformed from a secret criminal operation into a major crime scene. James's radio call had brought not only his entire unit, but also wildlife officials and law enforcement from both sides of the border. The poachers, caught completely off guard, had been arrested without a single shot fired. Their extensive documentation had exposed trafficking networks across 3 countries. The mother bear's rescue became a testament to human and animal cooperation. Wildlife veterinarians worked carefully to remove the snares, amazed by how calm she remained during treatment. The cubs stayed close, their behavior continuing to astound everyone present. They watched the whole process with remarkable intelligence, their eyes moving between their mother and the humans helping her, showing an understanding that defied conventional knowledge about wild animals. The discovery had far-reaching consequences. The poaching ring's documents revealed shipments of exotic animals to private collectors worldwide. The operation had been making millions of dollars, trading in rare species and leading to multiple international arrests. But perhaps more significant was how the incident changed our understanding of wildlife intelligence. Research teams began studying the area's bear population, particularly focusing on their ability to share knowledge. The mother bear's teaching behavior sparked new theories about animal cognition. Her cubs had demonstrated problem-solving abilities previously thought impossible in wild animals. Their capacity to remember past experiences, make logical connections, and seek specific human help revolutionized wildlife research. For James, the experience altered his entire perspective on wildlife interaction. The bears had chosen him, trusted him, and communicated their need with extraordinary clarity. The mother bear recovered fully, and wildlife officials often spotted her with her cubs in the area, continuing their remarkable behavior of teaching other bears to avoid human traps while recognizing friendly human presence. The forest changed too. With the trafficking operation shut down, wildlife began returning to their natural patterns. But the bears remained special. The cubs grew larger, yet maintained their unusual intelligence. They were sometimes seen watching the forest patrols from a distance, showing none of the fear typical of wild animals. They had become a living testament to the hidden depths of animal intelligence and the extraordinary bonds possible between species. Years later, when asked about that remarkable morning, James would always emphasize one thing. The real heroes were those cubs who defied every natural instinct to save their mother. Their courage, intelligence, and trust in human kindness had not only saved lives, but had opened our eyes to the remarkable capabilities of wildlife. Their story became a symbol of hope, showing that sometimes the most profound understanding comes from those who cannot speak our language, but find ways to touch our hearts nonetheless. Thank you for reading this incredible tale of trust, intelligence, and courage. If you enjoyed this story of extraordinary animal behavior and human compassion, hit subscribe to receive more amazing wildlife encounters and untold stories from the wilderness. Never miss another heartwarming moment of connection between humans and the remarkable creatures we share our world with.